Good morning. Welcome to this conference honoring Bob Jervis. On behalf of Columbia University, the Saltzman Institute, the Political Science Department, and the School of International Public Affairs, welcome. I will confess I'm so thrilled to see you all here today for many, many reasons, one of which is I feel like the proverbial wedding planner whose finally big day has arrived. So thank you all for being with us today. My name is Peter Clement. I'm currently the interim director of the Saltzman Institute, and I'm very honored, actually, to be part of this. Like many of you in the audience, most of you probably know or have worked with Bob Jervis. I'm a relative newcomer to Bob's cohort of friends. I met Bob back in 2005 when I was working at CIA. And Bob would come to the building, one of the few people with the amazing top-level secret clearances which allowed him to reach sensitive estimates. And his specialty was doing postmortems on very, very bad estimates, the most famous one being the Iraq WMD one. So at the time, I was a relatively senior manager at the agency, and I was Bob's point of contact. So he would come in the building, he had access to the building, a cool badge, didn't have to have everybody escort him, and I would take him around to meetings. And at the time, I knew Bob by name. I'd seen a couple of his books. I wasn't an IR guy. And I thought, God, this guy's pretty interesting, and he feels so comfortable here. And I noticed he always wore suits. So I thought, well, you know, he's like a normal guy, dressed up to come to the agency. And I realized, as I got to many visits, Bob would come, and I realized he's like a real intel guy. He knows a lot of the analysts. He likes to meet with the analysts. He really wants to get all the scoop. And frequently, when I later came to Columbia, I realized, wow, Bob really is like a case officer. He's recruiting all these sources to give him little tidbits here and there. And that's when I realized Bob is more than just a great scholar and academic. He really is an intel person. He loved intelligence. So that was how I met Bob. I know most of you here have worked with Bob, probably as an academic colleague or a scholar at conferences. When I came up here later, I got to see a whole different side of Bob. For one, he never wore suits. And I thought, wow, that's like, what's that about? The turtlenecks and the polo shirts in the summer. And I thought, wow, that's very different, Bob. And it was always the same. And when I would go back to the agency periodically, they'd say, what colored turtleneck was Bob wearing yesterday? Because they all knew the routine. They were different colors for different days. The other thing about Bob was I frequently would call him the Energizer Bunny, because this man had no bounds of energy all the time. And I don't want to steal the thunder from all the others who are going to be talking about Bob. But anyway, I am genuinely honored to be here. One of the best things Bob did when I first came here, he would have these brown bags. And every day he'd round up people, and he would literally, and he would say, come on with me. We'd go down on the poli-sci floor on the 7th floor, and we'd knock on everybody's doors and say, hey, we're having lunch. And I thought, wow, this is kind of curious. Are these people really going to show up? And I was amazed how many actually did. And then I realized, well, he's like a senior scholar, professor. You probably want to get to know him. And of course, a lot of people came to lunch. But the real reason they came is Bob was just a lot of fun. We had great discussions. We covered any range of topics. And that's when I realized Bob had such a diverse range of interests, medical journals, applying science to IR theory. And I thought, wow, his range of interest knows no limits. Now, today's program. If you read through the agenda today, there are two main topics. Both of the topics are subjects on which Bob had deep interests. The first one having to do with nuclear war theory. When we first started doing this, I wasn't so sure it was going to be so topical. But then again, I'm a Russia hand, and when Putin kept talking about nuclear this and nuclear that, I thought, yeah, it's probably relevant right now. Second panel, also very relevant, great power competition. We have a rising China, which may or may not still be rising. We have a Russia, which in my view has serious problems. I think everybody knows that by now. And then we also have the issue of the worldwide battle between will democracies survive or not? How big is the threat to the world's democracies? After the morning panel, we will have a segment before lunch where we'll have a couple of guest speakers. Professor Dick Betts will talk a little bit about his time with Bob. Bob's daughter, Alexa, will talk a little bit about being Bob's daughter. And then we will have a couple of videos, which I think you will find really cool. The other highlight of the day will come later in the afternoon. When we're done with the afternoon panel, we'll have two closing segments. The first, we'll be hearing from some of our distinguished Columbia University members, President Lee Bollinger, who, by the way, is a constitutional scholar in his own right, but I suspect most of you knew that. We will hear from Dean Karen Yarhimilo, who I will introduce later in more detail. And we will also have a very brief set of comments from the newest member of our Columbia and SIPA community, Hillary Clinton. Of course, I suspect some of you are also here because you'll have a chance to hear Avril Haines, the current Director of National Intelligence. She'll do comments for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will go to a fireside chat with Dean Karen Yarhimilo, which I know already since I've had a little sneak preview. Will be very stimulating, provocative, and hopefully I think you will get a lot out of that. I also suspect that sometime during the day, in all of the panels, we're going to get into some of Bob's favorite issues. Why do leaders do what they do? What drives these people? Why do they do things that some of us consider completely irrational, but others, and I would put Bob in this category, Bob was great at putting himself in other people's shoes and saying, maybe it's not entirely crazy. Look at the things that this person is dealing with, or their background, or their experience, basically the psychology of these leaders. A quick note on the panels. If everything goes according to plan, we do want to leave time for Q&A at the end of the morning panel and afternoon panel. We have, obviously, on the panel a first-rate collection of scholars, policymakers, and really one of the things that for me is most useful about this conference is it brings together scholars and policymakers. And I think Karen, our dean, would tell you that is really one of her goals and her vision here in her role as the dean. We want to do as much as we can to bring about that synergy, getting the writings and research of our academic scholars into the hands and minds of our policymakers, because ultimately that's where you can really make a difference. And by the way, I'm a big fan of policymakers, in large part because when I teach my Intel class, Intel and Foreign Policy, I always confess to everybody, it was way easier to be an analyst and do nothing but bring lots of bad news to policymakers, as opposed to the policymakers who then say, well, thank you for nothing. What am I supposed to do with this? Policymakers do not have easy decisions, particularly now in the digital age. They wrestle with any number of security challenges, obviously, terrorism, non-proliferation. But in my view, and I know Jay Healy is here, I'm scared to death of cyber. When people start talking about threats emanating in cyber world, I find that most scary, in part because so many actors have the ability to employ very active, offensive cyber actions. And they get to do it at the speed of light on social media, which to me is equally terrifying. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to be here today. I'm very excited about all the people who have given their time. We have a number of scholars who've come from all around the country to be here today, policymakers who've come from Washington, D.C. We've got scholars who've come from Boston, home of the Red Sox. I saw Steve is here with a Red Sox cap somewhere. So we have a variety of people from all over the country, and I'm delighted that they could come here today. We will see Avril. I will thank her later for taking the time from her busy day to be here today. For those of you who don't know Avril Haines, she previously was here for several years at Columbia, involved in Columbia's World Program, World Projects Program. So according to my watch, I actually have a couple of minutes. I will not abuse the ability to take more time here. A couple of logistical words for those of you who haven't had a chance to scout out the 15th floor. If you go out the back door, take a left at the elevators. The restrooms are on the corridors on either side, on the other side of the elevators. Another final request, If you have a few minutes, please read the program, particularly the BIOS part, because when we do the panels, we've asked the moderators not to talk about all the amazing accomplishments and scholarly publications of all our speakers. That way they can just introduce them very quickly with their affiliation in school. And hopefully you'll have a chance to read sometime during the breaks. Another point, we are on live stream today. So if you're not here in the room, we want to welcome you too. But also, for those who weren't able to get into the room today, we will be able to watch this later on SEPA YouTube. And with that, I will stop. If I could introduce now our panel on nuclear war theory. Please come on up to the front.